I'm very disturbed when that kind of publicity, but I like to show only the best of myself.
Night drifts slowly over Saint-Tropez. Not with spectacle, not with celebration, but with a heavy, deliberate quiet. There are no red carpets unfurled, no camera flashes slicing through the dark, no photographers hoping for one final smile. Inside a silent house, far removed from the noise that once followed her everywhere, Brigitte Bardot is spending her final hours alone with the echo of a life the world thought it already understood. How does the story of a woman who embodied desire, scandal, and myth all at once finally end? What happens when the ultimate symbol of an era reaches a moment where there is no one left to charm, provoke, or rebel against? For decades, Bardot was never just an actress. She was an earthquake in French culture, a provocation that never asked permission, a force that refused to be controlled. She challenged norms simply by existing, unsettled society simply by speaking, and redefined femininity simply by refusing to conform. But on this night, all of that power dissolves. The fame, the defiance, the legend, it all fades into the background. What remains is silence, fragility, and a question that seems to travel across Europe like an uneasy whisper. How do legends truly disappear? Quietly? Alone? Or weighed down by unresolved truths heavier than any applause they ever received? As the world sleeps, unaware that morning will bring historic news, time appears to slow inside that room. Every second stretches. Every breath feels significant. A reminder that even the most untouchable icons are not immune to endings. And it is here, in these unseen hours far from the public eye, that the real story begins. Not a story of glamour, but of goodbye. A farewell that forces us to confront the final chapter of a woman who permanently altered the meaning of fame, freedom, and scandal. Then dawn arrives, and with it, impact. The news breaks like a sudden glow. First, a brief alert on the phones of French journalists, then another, and another. Within minutes, headlines multiply. Brigitte Bardot has died. 3 simple words enough to halt conversations mid-sentence, interrupt live radio broadcasts, and send television networks scrambling to rewrite their schedules in real time. In France, the reaction is immediate and deeply emotional. This is not merely the death of an actress, it is the loss of a national symbol, a woman who both represented an era and relentlessly challenged it. In Paris, newspapers lead with stark black and white photographs of a young Bardot gazing into the lens, carrying that unmistakable blend of innocence and defiance that once captivated and unsettled the nation. And in Saint-Tropez, the place she transformed into legend, her name once again fills the air, whispered in cafes and echoed along familiar streets, as if time itself has folded back 50 years. Responses pour in rapidly. Politicians, filmmakers, musicians, writers, everyone feels compelled to speak, to define their relationship with a woman who was never neutral, never simple, never forgettable. Some remember her as a liberator, a figure who shattered expectations in a deeply conservative France. Others focus on the controversies, the explosive remarks, the public battles, the clashes with institutions and society itself. Bardot, even in death, refuses to offer consensus. On social media, the divide is immediate and striking. Alongside the flood of admiration and aching nostalgia, another current has quietly grown louder. Heated arguments about her legacy, her temperament, her contradictions, the decisions she made in her later years. For many younger people, Brigitte Bardot existed almost as an idea rather than a person, a famous name tucked inside books, documentaries, and grainy black and white clips. But for others, especially those who grew up with her face filling cinema screens and magazine covers, the news lands differently. It doesn't feel like the passing of a celebrity. It feels like losing a fragment of their own memory, a piece of youth slipping away with her. What lingers most, however, is the silence. An almost unsettling quiet surrounds the details. There are no images from her final day, no hurried hospital briefings, no microphones shoved toward grieving faces, no leaks, no spectacle. Everything about it feels deliberate, almost scripted, perfectly aligned with the life she chose for decades. A life lived away from the spotlight, far from the media storm she helped create and later escaped with fierce resolve. And it is precisely this contrast that gives her death its weight. A woman who once dominated magazine covers and movie screens across the globe fades from the world with almost no public witnesses. A global icon goes dark, privately. Inevitably, a question begins to form in the collective mind, growing louder the longer the silence lasts. How does someone rise to the absolute peak of worldwide desire, only to leave wrapped in near total quiet? How does a life that once burned so brightly come to such a hushed close? To understand those final hours, you have to travel far backward, past the fame, past the scandals, past the myth, back to the child she was before the world turned her into a symbol, back to the beginning of a life that seemed destined to shine and just as destined to fracture. Long before the world spoke her name with fascination and controversy, Brigitte Bardot was a fragile child, growing up in post-war Paris. Born in 1934 into a wealthy but rigid household, she was raised in an environment where discipline, reputation, and appearances outweighed warmth or emotional closeness. Affection was sparse. Expectations were heavy. From a very young age, she learned the rules: obey, stay composed, remain silent, and fit neatly into a mold that never quite felt like her own. Ballet became her first refuge. Inside the dance studio, reflected back at her through mirrors and repetition, she found structure, control, and a sense of beauty she could command. It was a place where emotion could be transformed into movement, where pain could be hidden inside precision. Yet even there, something in her refused to stay contained. It wasn't only her technique or her grace, it was presence. An intensity that spilled beyond choreography, unsettling her teachers and quietly captivating anyone who watched her dance. That same intensity carried her, almost without warning, from the protected world of ballet into the unforgiving exposure of cinema. She was barely 15 when she began modeling, and not long after, the camera discovered her. Or perhaps, more accurately, she collided with it. Her entrance into French cinema was sudden, almost violent in its speed. Brigitte Bardot did not behave like the others. She didn't move, speak, or even exist on screen the way a young actress was expected to. There was something raw, instinctive, untamed about her presence, a sensuality that didn't ask permission, and audiences responded instantly. Within just a few short years, Bardot went from a promising newcomer to an international phenomenon. And God-created woman didn't just launch a career, it sealed a myth. Bardot the actress transformed into Bardot the symbol, a global sex icon, a collective fantasy, and to many a dangerous challenge to the moral order of the time. Her image crossed borders, ignited controversy, inspired fashion, provoked censorship, and quietly reshaped ideas of female freedom in popular culture. Yet behind the endlessly reproduced image, the real person was slowly fading from view. Fame arrived too fast and with crushing force. Every step she took was scrutinized. Every relationship became public property. Every glance, every gesture, every silence was dissected and assigned meaning. Bardot didn't simply become famous, she became owned. Her love life turned into headlines, her marriages into spectacles, her body into a battleground for culture, politics, and desire. And while the world celebrated what it saw as a liberated woman, she began to feel increasingly trapped. In later interviews, Bardot would describe those years as living inside a golden prison, adored, envied, and completely exposed. There was no escape from the constant gaze, no refuge from the noise. The pressure was relentless. Privacy vanished. Even solitude felt watched. Exhaustion set in. Deep sadness followed, and more than once she tried to disappear, searching for a silence the world refused to give her. The smile the public had fallen in love with concealed a deepening unease, an unease tied to a persona she had helped shape, or perhaps one that had been imposed on her from the very beginning. As the years passed, the gap between Brigitte Bardot the woman and Bardot the myth widened until it became impossible to endure. The character the world worshipped no longer resembled the person trapped behind it. Each new film did not feel like an achievement, but a reminder of a life she no longer recognized as her own. And every thunderous round of applause meant to celebrate her only reinforced a harsher truth. There was no simple escape from the identity the world refused to let go of. Cinema, the force that had given her fame, power, and immortality, was also stripping something vital away: the freedom to disappear, to exist without being watched, to be ordinary, to be human. Then came the moment that left the world stunned. In an industry built on visibility, where aging actresses fought desperately to remain seen, Brigitte Bardot chose the unthinkable. She walked away. She turned her back on cinema, retreated from the spotlight, and shut the door on an industry that had both exalted her and slowly worn her down. To the public, her decision felt like a betrayal, even scandal. How could someone abandon such fame? But for Bardot, this was not a dramatic gesture or a statement. It was an act of survival. Yet leaving the screen did not deliver the peace many imagined. Far from the film sets, cameras, and suffocating expectations, Bardot faced something far more difficult: the emotional aftermath of a life lived under relentless pressure. Silence did not heal her wounds, it amplified them. In the absence of noise, every unresolved pain grew louder. Her retirement was not the closing scene of a story, but the opening chapter of another struggle, one that unfolded quietly, away from public applause, and largely misunderstood. She withdrew to Saint-Tropez, seeking refuge in a house that slowly became both sanctuary and stronghold. While the world continued to freeze her in time as an erotic icon, Bardot began reconstructing herself from a completely different foundation. The energy that had once been consumed by filming schedules, interviews, and promotion was redirected with fierce intensity towards something else, something that would come to define the second half of her life: the defense of animals. This was no pastime, no carefully curated reinvention. For Bardot, it was absolute, a fixation, a moral calling. The creation of her foundation marked a definitive break with her former life. From that moment on, her relationship with public opinion grew increasingly strained. Her voice became sharper, her words unfiltered, her tone uncompromising. She did not temper her statements for approval or soften her convictions to maintain favor. She accused, she exposed, she named names, and in doing so, she inspired fierce loyalty from some and deep hostility from others. As the years passed, controversy followed her relentlessly. Lawsuits, media outrage, and public condemnations became a recurring pattern. To many, the former muse of French cinema had transformed into a troubling and divisive figure. That transformation came with consequences. Bardot's world narrowed. She severed relationships, distanced herself from old companions, and withdrew further from public life. Her home filled with animals, creatures she trusted, but grew increasingly empty of people. Those few who encountered her in later years described a woman who remained intellectually sharp and unwavering in her beliefs, yet profoundly fatigued. The luminous softness of her youth had hardened into a gaze marked by severity and, at times, quiet sadness. Gradually, whispers about her health began to circulate. Public appearances became rare, then almost non-existent. Her statements grew brief. Invitations were declined without explanation. Tributes, anniversaries, and retrospectives were systematically refused. Bardot rejected celebration as firmly as she once rejected the spotlight itself. She no longer wanted to be on display, not even as a living legend. The applause of the past, once so intoxicating, now felt hollow, distant, almost burdensome. She preferred silence to any belated recognition. In the months leading to her death, that silence became heavier, denser, almost tangible. Messages from her inner circle were scarce. Interviews were non-existent. Public appearances, a memory from another life. For many, Brigitte Bardot had already become a figure of the past, a name found in photographs, films, and fading headlines. Yet, in truth, her story had not yet reached its most fragile, intimate chapter. The final weeks unfolded far from the glare of cameras, the flash of media lights, and the murmurs of spectators. There were no speeches, no public farewells, only the slow, deliberate passage of time, a body marked by decades, and the quiet awareness of a life lived to the extreme. In that deliberate isolation, Bardot confronted the inevitable, the same way she had always faced life, uncompromisingly, without spectacle, without apology. And then arrived the last days. Days when each gesture, each decision, each silence carried a gravity impossible to ignore. Days when the past condensed into the smallest, most ordinary moments. Days that drew her inexorably toward the final hours. Time no longer existed in weeks, projects, or social obligations. It existed in the rhythm of simple routines, in the stretch of silence, in small acts that only the closest could observe. Saint-Tropez remained unchanged, the same sunlit town she had once transformed into legend, but now it was a different stage entirely. Slower, quieter, suspended almost outside the world. Those who remained near her described a calm, measured pace. Bardot spent her days at home, surrounded by the animals she loved, deliberately avoiding anything that might disturb the fragile serenity she had created. No urgent calls, no uninvited visits. Everything seemed guided by a single desire, to preserve peace, to inhabit her own time. Her body bore the traces of years fully lived, yet her mind remained sharp, alert. She did not dwell on the past with theatrical nostalgia, nor confront the future with overt fear. Instead, there was quiet acceptance, a graceful acknowledgement of the inevitable. In these final days, there were no grand public statements, no staged farewells. Bardot had never been a woman to turn sentiment into spectacle. She closed her chapters in silence, as she had always done. Occasionally, brief practical conversations emerged, focused on the animals she had championed, on the continuity of her foundation. No dramatics, no ceremonies. The nights stretched long, slow, off-season, a striking contrast to the life of music, parties, and adoring gazes she had once led. Now, the only sounds were the wind through the trees, the distant crash of the sea, and the subtle, comforting rhythms of a life choosing peace over performance. In this solitude, there was no loneliness. There was intention. There was consistency. And then came the last day. Not with spectacle, not with headlines, not with final bows. Just as life itself had arrived for her, inevitable, quiet, absolute. The hours slipped by without a single disturbance to mark their passage. Outside, there was no gathering crowd, no flashing cameras, no reporters crowding the hospital corridors. The world beyond that quiet house remained entirely unaware of what was happening within, where one of the most recognizable faces of the 20th century was quietly approaching her end. To any passerby, those final hours seemed almost invisible, ordinary, yet inside, every second was laden with weight. Each breath slowed, each movement became more deliberate. The body, tired from a lifetime of exposure and expectation, demanded nothing but rest. There were no last words carefully crafted for the world, no statements meant to be remembered or replayed endlessly. And perhaps that was fitting. In her final years, Brigitte Bardot had chosen a life away from spectacle, away from the relentless gaze of fame, and so it was only natural that her final act would follow the same rhythm: private, unassuming, and absolute. Her passing came without fanfare. No sirens, no headlines announcing the moment, no instant waves of global reaction. It happened quietly, as she had lived, on her own terms. It was only hours later, when the rest of the world awoke, that the news began to seep out, cautiously, almost tentatively. The legend had reached her conclusion, but the story itself was far from over. The death of someone like Bardot does not simply close a chapter, it sends ripples outward, stirring curiosity, debate, and reflection. Questions surfaced immediately, interpretations clashed, debates about her legacy ignited. In the hours after her passing, the silence that had defined her final years persisted. Those closest to her maintained discretion with a precision that mirrored her own, confirming the news in measured, sober tones. Only then did the world begin to react, slowly piecing together a timeline that was as incomplete as it was inevitable. Reports said she had died peacefully at her residence in Saint-Tropez, absent of drama, absent of visible struggle. And yet, with a figure like Bardot, simplicity is never the full story. Was it truly serene? Who remained by her side in those last moments, and who was absent? Analysts and fans alike compared the public persona, the woman who had captivated the globe, who had sparked scandals and headlines, with the private farewell she chose. A life once lived in the glaring spotlight had quietly concluded in solitude, free from audience, speeches, or immediate accolades. For many, her final choice seemed almost inevitable, a final assertion of control in a life defined by both admiration and intrusion. For others, it was unsettling, a stark reminder of the cost of fame. What does it say about us as a society that a global icon could disappear completely, leaving only memories and whispers in her wake? Meanwhile, social media erupted, not with the sound of her passing, but with echoes of her life. Images from the past, scenes of youth and beauty, and reminders of the legend that was Brigitte Bardot. Bardot, young, free, provocative, lived in fragments. Pieces of films, iconic photographs, quotes repeated until exhaustion. Yet behind the glamour, behind the enduring images, there were always more uncomfortable debates waiting to resurface. Her controversial statements from recent years circulated again, splitting opinions. Some celebrated her radical frankness, her refusal to conform. Others questioned her moral legacy, wondering what her freedom had cost. Death did not soften the contradictions, it magnified them. In France, the conversation was particularly intense. Brigitte Bardot was not just a star, she was a symbol, deeply woven into the cultural identity of a nation. For one generation, she represented a daring break from the rigid post-war morality, a new kind of feminine freedom. For another, she remained unsettling, a reminder that liberation often comes with discomfort. Her passing forced a reassessment of that legacy, stripped of illusions, neither idealized nor dismissed, not reduced to controversy alone. Institutions offered measured tributes. Some expected grand public ceremonies, official gestures of farewell. But others remembered that Bardot herself had systematically rejected such honors throughout her life. Even in death, she seemed to set the rules. She did not want statues, did not want speeches. She wanted silence. and largely that is what she received. Yet beyond statements and debates lingered something harder to capture, the sense of a life that never quite fit any mold. Not the docile star, not the flawless heroine, not the public villain. Brigitte Bardot existed in tension with the world around her, and her end did not resolve that tension. It left it suspended, as if the air itself remembered her defiance. This is where the deepest question emerges. If we look at her life from that final silent moment, what truly remains? The myth? The provocation? The controversy? Or the story of a woman who, after being everything to everyone, chose to step back, to withdraw, in order not to lose herself completely? The answer is not simple, and perhaps it should not be. Some stories are not meant to be neatly concluded. They are meant to linger, leaving unease long after the headlines fade, long after the screen goes dark. Over time, the initial clamor dissipates, the debates cool, and what remains is subtler, more haunting, a memory that resists simplification. It is then that Bardot's figure transforms once again, not as news, not as scandal, but as memory. Her legacy defies categorization. She was not merely a successful actress, not just a sexual icon, not only a radical activist. She was all of these, and something else harder to define. A woman who never fully accepted the role the world tried to force upon her. Her life was a continuous act of resistance, first against the moral codes of her time, then against the industry that exploited her, and finally against the very gaze of the world. Seen from the end, her story takes on a new texture. That young woman who revolutionized European cinema, who changed how female desire was portrayed on screen, concluded her days by rejecting the gaze of others altogether. She chose silence over applause, privacy over adulation, freedom over recognition, a final, unmistakable act of defiance. The woman who spent her life surrounded by flashing cameras made a choice that startled the world time and again. She chose to disappear from them. This act, repeated over and over throughout her life, may be her most coherent, her most radical gesture. Brigitte Bardot's final hours were not filled with the spectacle that had defined so much of her existence. There were no grand declarations, no carefully staged reconciliations with the world of show business. Instead, she embraced the one thing she had always valued above all else: personal consistency. Her farewell was quiet, almost austere, a deliberate refusal to turn even her death into a performance. In that silence, she seemed to whisper a truth the world often forgets. Fame is only an episode, never a complete identity. For those who adored her, she remains the image of a woman ahead of her time, free, provocative, unafraid. For those who criticized her, she remains an uncomfortable figure, one who could not bend herself to the rules of public expectation. Yet through every chapter of her life, one question echoes. How much can a person endure when the world demands they be a symbol before they can simply be human? Perhaps this is the deepest lesson Bardot leaves behind, that behind the glittering myth, someone is always paying a price, that freedom as absolute as hers can come at the cost of profound isolation, and that even those who seem immortal ultimately confront the same silence we all must face. In her house in Saint-Tropez, far from the clamoring world, that silence became the final stage of her life. Not a punishment, but a deliberate choice. In that act, she claimed something fame could never give her: peace. The quiet that followed was not an absence, but a space for reflection, a moment to understand that her life was never about spectacle. It was about truth, even if that truth made others uncomfortable. In the weeks after her passing, Bardot ceased to be urgent news. She returned to what she had always been at heart: a mirror. Through her, each generation projected its desires, its fears, its contradictions. From the distance of her final hours, that mirror reflects a complex, often contradictory figure, impossible to reduce to a single convenient narrative. Her death, in its quiet defiance, mirrored her life. There were no public reconciliations, no gestures crafted for posterity. She closed her story with the same clarity and firmness that had defined her most daring choices. For some, this unwavering consistency is inspiring. For others, unsettling. But one truth remains undeniable. She stayed faithful to herself until the very last moment. Perhaps this is why her story continues to unsettle us. It forces us to confront what we demand from the icons we elevate. We want them to belong to us even in death, to explain themselves, to apologize, to fit into a narrative we can control. Bardot refused all of that, both in life and in her final farewell. She offered no explanations, no closure, no softened legacy. When the lights finally went out, what lingered was the sense of a woman who had paid dearly for living on her own terms, who tasted freedom and suffered its consequences, who was loved, desired, judged, and rejected, and yet chose to step away before the world could consume her entirely. Her story closes not with applause or resolution, but with a pause to reflect on the cost of fame, the solitude it brings, and the quiet dignity of someone who leaves before being fully lost. Because sometimes the final moment is not a spectacle, it is a whisper. And in the case of Brigitte Bardot, that whisper was not an end, but the ultimate expression of a life lived at the edge of public scrutiny, and finally, beyond it. She lived surrounded by lights, by cameras, by a world that never stopped watching. Brigitte Bardot, the face of an era, the symbol of freedom, beauty, and rebellion. But in her final hours, the flashes faded. The crowds disappeared. The applause, the controversies, the headlines, they all vanished into silence. Inside a quiet house, every breath became heavier, every moment slower, as one of the most iconic figures of the 20th century quietly approached the end. No grand farewell, no final statement, just the steady, unbroken rhythm of a life lived on her own terms. This is the story of her last hours, the final silence of a legend.